Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me, and if you're curious, hopefully you are, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without a greenhouse or grow lights or humidifiers, just me and them struggling along. So plant lovers, if that sounds like your bag, hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. I am a complete amateur and my ramblings are just that. And today, plant lovers, you might notice this beautiful little flower in front of us. Yes, it is a Paphiopedilum, and it was a seedling I bought. It has finally bloomed. So today, yes, this video is all about this Paph hybrid. And just so that we begin in the right manner, let me tell you what it is. And there is the tag, which says Western Sky Snow Cloud crossed with Spicerianum Turban. I think, there we go. So Spicerianum is a species name and the other bits are hybrids. So there's much to unpack about this and much to unpack about getting it to flower. Anyway, I can perhaps begin by saying I have made two, I think, slipper orchid, which is the common name for this type of orchid, collaborations with Nina of Ninja Orchids. So I'll link those above and below. I mean, it's quite funny because really growing Paphiopedilums is a learning curve and a work in progress. I don't think, well, perhaps you do master it. I certainly haven't. Anyway, I'm getting there incrementally. So some things I can do really well with, other things are still a work in progress. This is working, and there's a bit of a narrative around it, which we'll get to. But first, let's just have a little look at Paphiopedilum. Look at that flower. So I'm sure you're all familiar with what the flower shape is. Their common name is slipper orchid, I guess, because, you know, you could perhaps slide your foot into the end there. But that common name is actually used for many different types of orchids with similar shaped flowers, so it can be a bit confusing anyway. So we will stick with Paphiopedilum, and Paphiopedilums are an Asian group of orchids, and they're found from the Himalayas all the way sort of across those Southeast Asian hotspots down into Papua New Guinea, and I think that's where they stop. So there are none native in Australia, for example. And you know what? Why don't we consult some books? Now I have this fantastic book here, which is called Asian Orchids. Paphiopedilums are all Asiatic. I mean, they stretch across to New Guinea, which isn't in Asia, but you know what I mean. Now, obviously, there are a lot of species of Paphiopedilums which come from a variety of different environments, which would mean different care needs, because some are higher altitude and cooler, some are lower and warmer. Anyway, so there's a bit of a mix. Hard to generalize, but let's just see what this book says, which is Asian Orchids, written and photographed by Teoh Eng-Soon, MD, who is an amazing orchidist. And he says, Paphs grow on leaf mold and other organic debris that collect on the ground and in rock crevices. Some species grow in the lowlands on limestone formations, while others are epiphytic and live on old trees. Most species are found at high elevations in the tropics where it is always cool and humid. Where they are associated with mosses and ferns. Okay, next book is Orchids at Kew, edited by Joyce Stewart, and this is a 90s book. Very interesting, actually, about the orchids and the history of the orchid collection at Kew Gardens. And Joyce says, although Paphiopedilums grow in areas of very high rainfall, at least for part of the year, they flourish in situations where the drainage is good, and in cultivation the compost needs to be free draining at the same time as being moisture retentive. So, plant lovers, here we have two vital bits of information: cool, humid, free draining, and moist. How on earth do you juggle all of those things into your orchid care? So let's just try and tease it out bit by bit, and I'll start with the potted history, pardon the pun, of this plant. Okay, firstly, why do I love Paphs so, and why do I grow orchids, plant lovers? Well, it all started in lockdown, as many people's interest in orchids did. Now, we're going to get to this leaf in a minute. I know it's quite an attention puller because it's yellow and looks terrible. We're going to get to that, so don't worry. Back to me. Back in the day, Keira Knightley made a version of Pride and Prejudice, and Donald Sutherland played her father, Mr. Bennet, and I loved the art direction of that film. And in that film, there is a scene in Mr. Bennet's study when Lizzie Bennet goes in to reveals some great truth, and he has the great discussion with her, and he is tending his orchids. And in fact, he was tending a Paphiopedilum. Now, just that vision of him in this beautiful dark Georgian study with a terracotta pot with a smallish plant with this amazing flower always struck my imagination. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to be Donald Sutherland in a dressing gown in a Georgian library with pots of orchids that you just fiddle with? That, I honestly think, is the genesis of my desire to grow orchids in terracotta pots. So I guess then, everyone knows these flowers and tries to grow them. And perhaps easy for some and perhaps not so easy for others. I would say a work in progress for me. So when I began then deciding I was going to grow orchids, I bought a division of a fantastic Paphiopedilum hybrid called Duo de Citron, which is a sequential bloomer and has bright buttercup yellow, huge flowers with amazing lips. Now I'll drop an image of that in. I've made many a video about it. Interesting plant, very tough. It's a regular bloomer for me, although regular means every 2 years. So there's a whole year of growing without flower. But then I get 6 months of blooming when it occurs. So I think I've got that one right. Although I do realize that it needs repotting. So in fact, I'm going to make a repotting video about that because it's now probably 3 years. 4. So at that time, I was so sort of enamored of Paphiopedilums and the fact that that was in bloom, although I bought it as a division, so it was at a blooming stage. I bought quite a few seedlings, and this baby, this hybrid cross, about which I knew nothing, was one of them that I bought, and that was 3 years ago as a seedling. Now, let's talk then some basic care, shall we? Okay, let's refer back to our book, Asian Orchids, and this little gem of information here. As a rule, the cool-growing Paphiopedilums have plain green leaves, while warm-growing Paphiopedilums have mottled leaves of dark and whitish green. Cooler, and here we have a speckled one, warmer. Well, there you go. So that is a generalization. But look, let's just backtrack a minute because this brings us to the key point, which is care. Now, I grow Paphiopedilums largely indoors. However, I made a decision about this one, which resulted in its blooming. Let's just go over the saga from the beginning. So I bought this as a seedling. I repotted it immediately in a loose, free-draining mix, which I think can be improved on because, as we read, they need to be moisture retenting but free draining. But anyway, we'll get to that. And I potted it in this pot. They, like most orchids, many orchids, like to be quite root constrained, so you don't want to over pot it. So you want to find a pot that just fits the root ball. And they're quite tough, thick roots in these plants. And when I do my repotting video in the next couple of weeks, you'll see. So I bought my array of seedlings and off we went, and I just watched, and you know, they just kind of languished and didn't really get up to much. I think I may have lost a couple. Some just looked a bit insipid. I probably potted them on or repotted them too soon, as they probably weren't that long out of their flasks. They were still quite small. In that case, it would have been perhaps a good idea just to grow them on in the existing potted medium if it was in good condition for at least another year. Anyway, I didn't. There's a learning. And then I had all these kind of little sticky, spindly Paphiopedilums not really getting up to much. After a couple of years, I got a little bit bored with them all and they just didn't look great and thought, you know what, nothing much is happening, time to make a shift. So I then decided maybe I should do some research. Now this is what I would really recommend you do if you get a hybrid Paphiopedilum such as this beauty here, and that is look at the names of the hybrids that it's constructed from in a very Frankenstein-y way and research what the species ancestor is. Now to do that, there is an amazing website out of the States called orchid-roots.com. So if you, and I'll put that link below for you. Now, for example, in this case, we have got Western Sky Snow Cloud. So if you put into Google Paphiopedilum, Western Sky Snow Cloud, orchid-roots.com, it will take you straight to that page and you'll follow the family tree down literally to mother and father, great grandparents, and you'll see the species names that it came from. And then Google each of those species names and you'll go to orchidspecies.com and just have a little look at their basic conditions. Are they high elevation, cool growing? Are they lower elevation, more tropical growing? Then you can make an educated guess about where your plant sits. So according to that book that we just looked at, this one with its very, very mottled leaves is a warmer grower, and the other loose generalization is that the mottled leaves prefer lower light than the plainer shiny leaves like this one. However, I think that is a generalization, and my observation is that they actually like a little more light than we might consider. Because if you imagine, the ones that are high altitude are growing in these wonderful misty forests, but they're often in a very bright environment. It's just that there is a lot of cloud cover and mist, which is giving a filter. It's like a Vaseline lens or shade cloth. So it's very bright indirect light. However, it's just very protected. Also, these things are often at the base of trees, so there's lots of filtered light that's then coming through there. So quite a difficult generalization to say they are low lights, this is low light, this likes brighter light. I've just found they don't like bright indirect light, but they need indirect light. You got to figure out each one, and I think that's the other learning for me, is that it isn't one size fits all with all of your paths. So this one is in a different spot to this one. Which brings us back to my story. Now, sorry I'm boring you. I was bored with this. It was a little seedling, wasn't really growing much, wasn't thriving, weren't many new leaves, and I thought, oh well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I had a look, and I discovered that one of the ancestors, Spicerianum, which is that name you can see there, is a high altitude Himalayan species orchid from Assam and Bhutan, Nepal, across there, the sort of that part of the Himalayan range, and across into southern China, where most of these Paphiopedilums come from, actually, that region, northern Vietnam, southern China, the Himalayan parts of India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Assam, etc. So out of the ancestor species, one of them was a lowland warmer grower, but all the others were high altitude, cooler growers. And I thought, well, maybe it's just going to do better outside. Now, I've done an experiment with a different Paphiopedilum seedling, growing one outside in winter all year and one inside, and they were both the same cross, bought at the same time and the same age. The one I grow inside all year flowered and is a healthier plant. The one I grow outside for one winter didn't die, but it was a much smaller plant and has never flowered. And also that one suffered from root rot. Still alive, still hanging on, and in fact it's on the shelf behind us. So again, you can't just say, oh yes, they'll all take the same conditions. However, this one I decided most of its ancestors were high altitude Himalayan plants, so I'm just going to throw it out in the garden, well not literally, and just see what happens. And I will show you exactly where it is. So I put it in a spot where it gets reasonable diffuse light, but it does get very early morning direct light, but I mean very early, when the sun is not fierce and it's really quite cool. So particularly in winter when the sun is lower, it gets that kind of light. In summer it is more protected from direct light, but there is a bigger sort of wash of general indirect light. God, is that sounding confusing? But anyway, there it was on this corner, which I would consider on the darker side of my orchid growing environment, which just counteracts everything I said, that sometimes they need a little bit more light than you imagine, anyway. And it very quickly grew a second fan, which you can see here. And then I noticed that 3 or 4 months ago, a flower bud, which just filled my heart with joy. And I would have thought, looking at that plant, it was relatively small and perhaps too small to flower, but no, it did. So what I've learned, plant lovers, is that this particular cross loves those cool, humid, moist conditions that we just read about in the book. Even though it's quite a complex hybrid of many, many different species, this particular incarnation of all that DNA likes those conditions. So this is the thing, growing Paphiopedilums, it ain't that simple. You do have to kind of figure out which one you've got and what's the optimum conditions. So I would say that most of them will grow very happily indoors all year, depending where you are in the world, of course. Here in Melbourne in Australia, we do get quite hot summers, and that can just throw a bit of a spanner in the works, given that these are high altitude Himalayan plants where it probably doesn't get to 40 degrees or 100 plus Fahrenheit. But the trick then is to try and keep the conditions as cool and humid as possible, which means plenty of water and plenty of sort of ambient spraying if it gets really hot. Anyway, With this seedling then, I think I've cracked the condition. It loves being outside, and I know that Spicerianum, the pure species orchid, grows very well outdoors in Melbourne all year, and most people grow it that way here. By outdoors, I also mean under cover, so it's not being rained on. Other great news is Paphiopedilum blooms will last a couple of months. They're very, very long lasting, as long as you haven't got some cunning insect that has decided it knows how to pollinate them, in which case the flower will drop off and you get a seed pod. But hopefully, I don't think any Australian insect has quite figured out the secret of fertilisation of this baby just yet. Other general care. Now, I do try and keep this moist all the time. It's in a terracotta pot, which evaporates quite quickly, but that is a positive in this case because it free drains and evaporates. You just water it more regularly. And I water this all throughout winter, and literally the last couple of days we had temperatures that got down to 0 degrees centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit in Melbourne. Very unusual we get that cold here in the city. And just a few streets away there was quite thick icy crusts on car windscreens, so we had a frost again, which is quite unusual. But these plants are undercover. It's a few degrees warmer, so it didn't get that cold. But this plant seems to thrive in these cooler, moist, humid conditions. And despite that really cold weather, as you can see, looking really, really healthy, which brings us perhaps to the point of that slightly yellowed leaf. Now, this seedling, as I said, I think it's about 3 years old, and I have not lost a leaf since I bought it, and I've gained many, as you can see, and I've got a new fan growing here. Yellow leaves can often frighten the orchid grower, particularly the novice one, because you think, oh, what am I doing wrong? I've killed my orchid. But let me get my fabulous little Chinese scissors. Here we are. So effectively, they're old leaves, and this year this leaf is probably 4 years old. It's one of the first leaves on the plant. So just a good sort of basic rule of thumb, you see the plant here, this is the first leaf. It's an old leaf. If such a leaf turns brown or black or starts to discolor and wants to drop off, I wouldn't worry. If this was happening to one of these leaves, the newer ones, then you want to start worrying, because new growth shouldn't be discoloring and looking sick. If it does, you've probably got some investigating to do. But this is an old leaf, and it's a natural part of the plant's life cycle that those old leaves should discolor and fall off. I'm not going to wait for it to fall off because it is distracting from the beauty of the flower. So I am just going to snip off that leaf. Okay, let's talk about the flower. Isn't it just stunning? So we've got this sort of white part up here with a wash of mauve, and then sort of lime green with burgundy through these parts of the flower here, and this really, really strong lip, which inside is quite a deep burgundy as well. You see, beautiful. And if you look at all of the different ancestors that this has been hybridized from, you can see elements of all of these parts of the flower in its sort of genealogical history. And there's been a huge amount of hybridization for Paphiopedilums over the last century. They've been very desired and very worked upon as a group of plants. So you'll find all manner of different hybrids wherever you are. Some have huge showy flowers, some have massive lips, some have little traily bits at the side, some are sequential, some are green flowers, some are bright. I mean, all manner of things. You can sometimes get multiple blooms on one stem. Everything that is possible has been bred into these orchids. So at the basic care then, I fertilize it throughout the growing season. So in the warmer months, a little bit of topical slow release fertilizer, and then a liquid fertilizer, maybe every 2 or 3 waterings during summer and the warmer months, which can either be a liquid-based orchid-specific fertilizer or something like a tonic, which is a seaweed-based solution, or sometimes worm juice, which is the overflow from a worm farm. All of those I dilute to at least 1/10 of the recommended dose, so it's not too strong. I don't fertilize in winter, but I do still give it a little bit of a tonic in winter if it's a particularly warm day and I know everything's going to evaporate quite quickly. Because although I do water it, generally with orchids that you have to water in winter outdoors here, I don't want them to be wet and cold. However, I must say that I have given this a real drenching on quite cold days, and so it has been quite moist at night when the temperature drops. Loves it. So I think if you were trying to grow this particular cross at home, you just need to make sure that you keep those temperatures quite cool. So it needs to be in a cooler part of your house, particularly if you've got winter central heating. So a porch or something. So close to the house and enclosed, but perhaps not as heated as your interior. Or an unheated greenhouse. Well, there we are, plant lovers. I think we've covered everything. I'm just so excited. This is a first new bloom for me. So the Paphiopedilums I've already got that bloom just keep blooming. That's great. This is the first sort of new one for me, and I'm really, really thrilled. So from a seedling, it's in its 4th year that it decided to flower, which is about the same cycle as a Cymbidium seedling from woe to go in terms of its first flowering. So not wildly unusual, but a bit of a commitment. And perhaps the thing that triggered the blooming was I'd given up on it and just put it outside because I didn't care anymore. You know, sometimes tough love works. Well, there we go, plant lovers. Look at that beauty. I haven't repotted this one yet. I bought this beginning of the year, I think, and it was in bloom. And then this fan just emerged really, really quickly. And I was kind of thinking it might flower. You can't see anything though. So I didn't want to repot it until I knew what was going on with that fan. But with any repotting of these, I would tend to do it in spring or whenever it's not in flower anyway. As you can see, they don't have pseudobulbs, so they do effectively or can effectively grow throughout the year. So you could repot it at any time of the year. I would just avoid extremes of cold, extremes of heat when you chose to repot it. So there we are, Western Sky Snow Cloud crossed with Spicerianum, Turban. This is your life. Thank you very much. What a beautiful flower. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this perhaps somewhat rambly epic about my continuing Paphiopedilum journey. I think for everyone though, it's not that simple. It is constantly an evolving work in progress. Getting there with these, I hope you are as well. Many, many thanks for watching. I do post every week, so hit subscribe if you want to know what my rambling might be next week. Remember, I am an amateur knowing very little about such things, as this has proven. Sometimes things are just lucky accidents that you kind of stumble across the right conditions and pa-da, or padam, as Kylie Minogue would say, it blooms. So thank you very much. I very much look forward to seeing you next week with whatever mad ramblings we will have. And until then, take care, and I'll see you next week.